Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. All right, we are here with Carleton University's Philippe Lagassé. Philippe has experience on military procurement panels, and so I figured he'd be the perfect person to talk to about the issue everyone is talking about right now, which is the F-35s and whether we can outright cancel the contract or whether we should outright cancel the contract or whether that's no longer a possibility. Because everyone is making different judgments about how that process should be going right now, given everything. So, Phil, I guess top line, I guess where are we sitting now in terms of the process?
So we have a contract for initial 16 planes
Right.
for the F-35. The plan is to buy 88. It's also important to recognize that you're not just buying jets. You're getting infrastructure in place. You're getting a training regiment in place. So we have pilots currently training down in the U.S. We have various Canadian industry feeding into the program because it's a multinational program. So it's not just built in the US, it's built pretty much all over the world. People contribute various parts to it. Also munitions. Anyway, all this to say, it's an acquisition that's multifaceted. It's got a lot of different things, even in terms of our operational construct, how we see ourselves playing in NORAD in the future
Mm-hmm.
is tied into that aircraft. So it's a multi-pronged thing, and right now, from what we understand, the government is looking back over the contract and seeing what the alternatives are.
Yeah. I mean, some of the things I've heard are that we might have to take these 16 essentially because we'll have no choice. Also, just because the existing CF-18s are quite literally rusting out and be unable to be upgraded any further. But wondering what the abilities are to pivot to something outside of those 16 in terms of all the different considerations.
Okay, so let's look at each of those issues in sequence.
Okay.
When it comes to the CF-18 fleet, so when you hear that the CF-18 is going to be retired in 2032, that means that the last of the CF-18s are going to be retired in 2032.
Right.
We have kept these things going for so long that we have become masters at analyzing the plane. So out in Mirabel, they are able to scan the entire body of the aircraft for the most minute of cracks and whatnot, and they're able to say how much life is left in the airframe, how much more can you push it. And so they have a realistic full fleet view of which ones can fly for longer and which ones are really kind of nearing a danger zone.
Okay.
And so there, you could certainly keep the thing in the air, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like you could see this to the max, right? In the sense of you could keep a plane flying for a good amount of time. Is it going to be safe? No. Is it going to be a plane that you would send into any kind of danger zone or a situation where there might be an adversary? You would not want to do that because unless you pour billions of more dollars into trying to upgrade it further, which would not make sense given that the fundamentals of the aircraft are now reaching the end of their life.
Yeah.
So the plan has always been that starting in 2026, as you're bringing on new aircraft, the CF-18s get retired based on which ones need to be which ones are the closest to the end of their life.
Okay.
So there's that. So that's kind of timeline that we're dealing with, right? Like, and we've known from the past, like we don't really want to play too much with this, as we've seen with the maritime helicopter. Like we don't want to
Yes.
create an episode like this. So would it make sense to have 16 F-35? No, that makes no sense to
Okay.
have 16 planes because people think, well, if you're a jet fighter pilot, you can fly jets. No, if you're a jet fighter pilot, you can fly. You have to be trained to fly a specific jet, right? which isn't to say that you can't fly more than one. You could be trained on more than one, but the amount of time and effort that goes into in maintaining your proficiency on a particular aircraft is not insignificant, right?
Right.
Similarly, everything that comes to infrastructure, the labs, particularly with the F-35, because it gets maintained through a very kind of advanced software system. To put all of that in place for 16 aircraft is a very insufficient use of funds, very inefficient use of funds. So 16, just the initial 16 is probably not a great idea, right? That would be a very costly endeavor. Does that mean that you need to get all 88? Maybe not, right? Your viewers will recall that the original plan under the Harper government was to get 65.
Right.
And we moved up to 88 because the Liberal government, through their analyses, determined that there was a gap, that we didn't have enough fighters. Now we can maybe get into that, but there was a lot of politics involved there. But it's up to 88. You could, however, have a mixed fleet, right? You might say we'll get maybe X number of F-35s. That kind of makes sense in terms of the investment in the infrastructure, the munitions, the training, and then we'll have an alternative fighter. It's just important to realize that is very costly. It's not something that we've done for a long time.
Yeah.
It introduces inefficiencies, but there's some advantages too, right? You can't deny that. It's good to have redundancy, and all the risks that people have raised around the ability of the United States to withhold parts or whatever are legitimate. I would only note that if you're only focused on the F-30 as that being a problem of the F-35, you're missing the picture. This is true of most American kit that we own, and we own a lot of it.
Yeah.
The F-35 is just one piece of the kind of capability that the Canadian Armed Forces have that are tied into American systems in various ways, shapes, and forms.
Yeah, and I've also heard issue, and I don't know how legitimate it is that, for example, the Saab Gripens use American engines, and therefore the Americans could deny the ability for us to use those as well if they really wanted to. And I don't know, again, I don't know how legitimate that is, but this is something that I've read.
Well, I mean, worst case scenario, you end up paying additional cost to put in another engine or whatever it is, right? But I mean, this is the kind of stuff that you get down this road and you start seeing all the complexity of what's being proposed. And the other point to make here, people assume because the competition came down to F-35 and Saab that somehow there's a mechanism whereby you say, okay, well, we're just going with the second one.
Yeah.
Well, that's not typically how procurement works, right? There are rules and regulations here. You would need to, presumably, if you're going to say we're going to look at an alternative, you may want to look back at the requirements that you had, and would that open the possibility for the other European fighters who chose not to participate? Would they then be interested? Who knows, right? There might be a possibility for the government to find a way to expedite this and to do a sole source of only the Gripen, but I wouldn't take that as a given. As we're trying to build relationships with Europe right now, do we want to go to the French and the British and say, no, we're not even giving you a shot because we're just deciding we're not? I mean, that might fly, but it might not.
Okay, so that's one fighter. I mean, we've also just sole sourced the Poseidons. We've there's all these other bits of American, I guess, kit or aircraft that we've already committed to purchasing. So I'd imagine that's going to be an issue. But the other thing that kind of strikes me is that you had, at least, for example, during the Liberal leadership debates, everyone was promising they're going to spend all this money on recapitalizing our defense in Canadian industries. And that sounds to me like an invitation for Bombardier to give us a bunch of vaporware that may or may not work. So I just wanted to, I guess, explore some of this a little more as well.
Sure. So in the Liberals' 2024 Arnold Strong and Free defense policy, they indicated that they're considering their options for an airborne early warning system.
Right.
So effectively an AWACS. Now, in that context, the Saab Global Eye operates on a Bombardier 6500. It's a very known capability. It's been exported to various countries. Other companies operate on that same platform, so you wouldn't need to kind of you could leverage that contract
Okay.
in lieu of trying to do a maritime patrol aircraft with Bombardier, which, as you say, like there's all the torpedo issues and all the rest of it related to that. But they do actually have a platform that could work for one of the capabilities that we've identified. So that's good
Okay.
news.
All right. That's good to know.
Yeah, no, so there is possibility there. Similarly, tactical helicopters would be another one. We do have companies that make really good drones, like small drones. So we have a lot out there. We can't do everything though. Like, we need to
Yeah.
be realistic about what we can do in the short to medium term versus the long term. And I think this is where the discussion ultimately has to kind of start focusing. And you've seen a little bit of this in what happened when the prime minister went to Europe, where, we want to start building partnerships such that we might have some production lines here, knowing that Europe might be at capacity in terms of what its industry can do. It would make sense for everybody to kind of build up some additional capability, industrial capacity here. So that's another possibility, like
Mhm.
in terms of vehicles or who knows what.
Yeah.
So in the short term, you're right. We're fairly limited in what we can do. There are some things that we could definitely buy in the short term here in Canada. But I think the plan is to leverage some of this cooperation long term. And I'll just give kind of some hypotheticals here of
Mhm.
like what this might look like. You can imagine a situation where the auto industry just gets really hit by tariffs. It might make sense in that context to say, like, okay, what are we going to do with some of these workers? Are there other types of production lines that we can build, or other types of capability in industry that we can build in those regions that are deeply affected by these tariffs or the layoffs that ensue or whatever it is? Now, I'm not saying you replace an entire industry.
Yeah.
It is an interesting facet that we have this kind of manufacturing base that is currently focused on one thing that, hey, you never know, could do something else.
Okay. That's interesting. Um, and the other thing I think you and I have possibly talked about before, and also with our good friend Steve Sadman, is that once we reach our 2% targets for NATO or higher, that part of the challenge becomes sustaining that. And I
Mhm.
wonder how much of that needs to fit into this conversation as well.
Well, I think that's the big kind of issue here. As you know, it's one thing to reach the target, but what happens, let's say, if 3 or 4 years or 4 years from now, a Democrat is elected, a real effort is made to kind of return to the U.S. of old, and we become complacent again. We all say, "Oh well, whew, that was a doozy," you
Yeah.
know. And the pressure's off, and all of a sudden, we get into our typical Canadian habit of being like, "Well, do we really need to be doing this?"
Yeah.
And we
Yeah.
start not recognizing that there are some long-term shifts happening in the US here that we have to be mindful of. So that's always a risk, right? Like, and
Hmm.
this is where industry in Canada, they're going to have to be really encouraged and brought along to participate in this plan, because they need some assurance from government that this is long term.
Yeah.
And this is otherwise, why would they get involved? Like, why would they tool up and make all the investments that we're asking them to make if they have no real guarantee that we're going to stick to this? And this is why it has to, there's a strong argument to make this partnerships with other states. Because if you have a fairly consistent market that you could sell your goods to, and if you know that it's not just Canada, and then you're left kind of selling to other countries and of various regime types,
Yeah.
if you know that there's a buying base, right, because you've set up a partnership with the Europeans and they're dependent on your supply chain too, then it makes sense to invest. In the absence of that, though, it may not get off the ground.
Okay. Well, that's an interesting, I guess, yeah, longer term perspective for things that governments need to start thinking about, and things that work beyond 4 year cycles.
Right. I mean, this is the big thing. It's very easy to tell Canadian industry that you want to spend more on defense and that you're going to be committed to this. The reality is, regardless of whether Canada spends 2% or if it spends 3%, there's still not enough Canadian business to sustain a significant defense industrial base in the absence of other markets that we can sell to. So when you create these partnerships and you create treaties and agreements, then industry gets a little bit more comfortable with what you're asking them to invest in.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to insulate it from the Canadian propensity to immediately start cutting that defense spend once the pressure is off.
Yeah. All right. All right. And just to close this off here, this week in the election campaign, Mark Carney made a promise around like rapidly recruiting 14,000 new personnel, and increasing the pace at which procurement happens. From my perch, seems to think this is possibly fantasy thinking, given the challenges of recruitment that the military has had over the last couple of decades. But maybe I'm wrong. Just wanted to get some of your perspective on some of these things that we've been hearing.
Well, I don't think you could have a prime minister or a party not promise something like that just because it's such a pressing issue, right? I mean, the reality
Yeah.
is the military is aware of the fact that they need to address this. They're making inroads. It's a slow process because this is part of the problem. We tend to think of military capability either as a fixed good or as an insurance policy, but it's best to think of it as a muscle.
Hmm.
And when you let a muscle atrophy, you can't suddenly go from lifting 2 pound weights to lifting 100 pound weights. You're going to injure yourself.
Yes.
You have to build up slow. And this is unfortunately the reality when you're dealing with something like recruitment for an all volunteer force that's very professional like ours is you got to kind of pace yourself to get it back up. Now, so what we're seeing is not a challenge of getting people in the door. People actually want to join.
Mm-hmm.
They are trying to get in. What we're dealing with is a processing problem. Like once we get them in, we can't get them trained fast enough, and we can't put position in part because we're lacking people, right? So there's a bit of you're in a tough spot because on the one hand, you need to have people in order to process people and take in more people.
Yeah.
And that's really where we're having a bit of a difficulty. But I agree with you. It's going to be difficult. I think all parties are going to promise it. The pay increase might make a big difference.
Yeah.
That might help. And you may not, part of the goal may be, okay, we may not be able to get 14,000 people in the door, but maybe if we can convince 7,000 not to leave and then get 7,000 in,
Yeah.
it's already looking better, right?
Yeah.
And the other thing that was interesting in the Carney announcement was that's not really getting picked up is this notion of legislation for procurement, and that could be interesting as well in terms of, are we going to find other ways to speed up the process? So,
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks again for taking the time to do this, and we'll chat again in the near future.
thanks, Al.
All right. And that's everything for this week. Join us again next week for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith. It's at journo_Dale on Twitter and journodale_no_ on Bluesky. And don't forget to like the video, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.